What you are about to see is officially considered impossible. Scientists found 16 nuclear reactors that are 2 billion years old. This incredible discovery defies everything we have been taught about history. Crucial data from the site was immediately classified by the military. But the truth is far stranger than you could ever imagine. Stay until the end for the most shocking reveal of all. In 1972, French physicists in Gabon found something utterly impossible. While analyzing uranium ore, they uncovered a secret deep within the Earth. This incredible discovery would defy all known laws of the natural world. They found startling evidence of ancient nuclear reactors buried beneath the ground. These were not modern reactors, nor built by any known ancient civilizations. The reactors had been operational an astonishing 2 billion years ago. That's not millions, but billions of years before the first humans appeared. This was a time before any intelligent life was ever thought to exist. Yet, 16 distinct zones showed the signature of sustained nuclear fission. These were controlled atomic reactions that demanded precision and advanced forethought. This discovery completely challenged everything that we have ever been taught. An official explanation for this impossible finding was delivered very swiftly. Scientists called it a natural phenomenon, a perfect geological anomaly. They said it was a 1 in a million chance, a simple fluke of nature. But there were many important details they chose not to emphasize publicly. For instance, the uranium at Oklo was depleted in a peculiar manner. Its uranium-235 isotope was missing in very specific, calculated ratios. The ratios perfectly mirrored the spent fuel from a modern power plant. The reactor zones themselves were arranged in strange geometric patterns. Their spacing strongly suggested intentional placement, not a random natural occurrence. And perhaps most unsettling of all, the French government quietly classified a significant portion of the research. Crucial data disappeared into military archives. Independent scientists were denied access to the site, and inconvenient questions were actively discouraged. Years later, when NASA scientists reviewed the available Oklo findings, they saw something else. The reactions had been moderated, controlled with a sophistication that prevented a meltdown. Water flow had been managed, heat distribution was uniform. It looked less like a random accident and more like an engineered system, perhaps for power generation, or maybe even for the disposal of nuclear waste from a far older source. But no one in the mainstream scientific community dared to say that part out loud. You might assume this is where the story concludes. A single strange anomaly, buried in the geological record, explained away and largely forgotten. But Oklo is not an isolated case. For over a century in the mountains of South Africa, miners have been unearthing something equally impossible. They are small, metallic spheres, perfectly formed, with 3 parallel grooves etched around their equators. Known as the Klerksdorp spheres, these objects are extracted from rock strata dated to 2.8 billion years old. That is 500 million years older than the Oklo reactors. It's a chasm of time so vast that the continents had not yet drifted into the shapes we would recognize. Life on our world was little more than single-celled organisms adrift in primordial oceans. And yet, these spheres exist. Hundreds have been found. Some are crafted from an iron-nickel alloy, while others are composed of pyrite. What makes them truly unnerving is their precision. The grooves are not accidental scratches. They are evenly spaced, running parallel around the center of each sphere with a level of accuracy that geologists concede should not appear in nature. Some of the spheres are hollow, containing a spongy material within. Others are solid. Museum curators present them with ambiguous labels, gesturing vaguely toward natural mineral formation. But when questioned, they cannot explain how nature produces such uniform geometry. They cannot explain the grooves. And they certainly cannot explain why these objects are found exclusively in rock layers from this one specific ancient period. In 2007, a curator at a South African museum secured one of these spheres inside a locked display case, leaving it completely untouched. In the months that followed, the sphere began to rotate slowly on its own axis. There were no vibrations, no external interference, just a slow, inexplicable movement. The curator documented the phenomenon, and then that documentation was quietly withdrawn from public access. These are not tales passed down through folklore. These are not myths. These are physical objects, sitting in museums and laboratories at this very moment. The uranium depletion at Oklo is a verifiable scientific fact. The Klerksdorp spheres are real artifacts you could see with your own eyes if you traveled to South Africa. But the explanations we are offered, the natural causes, the geological flukes, they demand a belief in coincidences, so extreme that the odds themselves become meaningless. So we are left with a critical question. If these discoveries are natural, why is nearly every attempt to study them more deeply obstructed? Why did the French government classify its research at Oklo? Why do museums shy away from detailed analysis of the spheres? And most importantly, why is the simple suggestion that these might be artifacts of something older, something we are not meant to know about, dismissed so aggressively and so completely? The evidence we are told shouldn't exist just keeps surfacing. Because Oklo and Klerksdorp are not isolated incidents. In 1891, a woman in Illinois split open a lump of coal and found a delicate gold chain embedded within it. The coal was extracted from a seam dated to 300 million years old. In 1912, an iron cup was found fused inside a block of coal in Oklahoma. The age was the same, 300 million years. That is 100 million years before the first dinosaurs walked the earth. These discoveries were documented in local newspapers at the time. Photographs were taken, and witnesses signed affidavits, and then the artifacts vanished. Some were sent to the Smithsonian Institution, where they were catalogued and never displayed again. Others were brushed aside as hoaxes, without any serious investigation. The pattern is always the same. Physical evidence emerges, it is documented, then it either disappears into an archive or is explained away by increasingly improbable natural causes. What we are witnessing is not a single mystery, it is a pattern of evidence, a pattern that points to something extraordinary, something that existed long before us, something that left its traces in the rock, in the uranium, in the metal, and in the coal. Traces that have no right to be there, traces that we are assured do not mean what they appear to mean. But what if they do? What if the history of our planet is not the simple, linear story we learned in school? What if intelligence, technology, and civilization are not phenomena that appeared for the first time with humanity? What if we are not the first? What if everything we believe about our own uniqueness, about our place at the pinnacle of evolution, about being alone in Earth's long history, is wrong? That is the question we are here to explore, and the evidence, as unnerving as it is, lies waiting for us in the rocks. The very notion that an advanced civilization could have existed on Earth millions of years before humanity sounds like science fiction. It seems like the kind of idea that should be laughed out of any serious academic conversation. And for a long time that is precisely what happened. Anyone who dared suggest such a thing was branded a conspiracy theorist, a fringe thinker, someone not to be taken seriously. But in 2018 something shifted. Two scientists, one from NASA and the other from the University of Rochester, published a paper that posed a question the scientific establishment had long avoided. Titled, "The Silurian Hypothesis." It was authored by Gavin Schmidt, director of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies, and Adam Frank, a professor of astrophysics. These were not fringe researchers. They were credentialed, mainstream scientists at the highest levels of their fields. And they asked a simple yet profound question: if an industrial civilization had existed on Earth millions of years ago, would we even be able to find evidence of it today? Their conclusion was unsettling. Probably not. Now let me be clear about what this paper was and was not. Schmidt and Frank were not claiming that such a civilization definitely existed. They were conducting a thought experiment, testing the very limits of our knowledge about deep time. But the mere fact that NASA scientists were willing to publish this question tells you something vital. It tells you that the evidence for our own special place in history is far more fragile than most people realize. The core of the problem is this: the geological record, the layers of rock and sediment that hold Earth's history, is not a complete library. It is not even close. Geologists estimate that we have access to perhaps 0.1% of everything that has ever happened on this planet. The rest 99.9% has been destroyed, recycled by tectonic plates, subducted back into the mantle, eroded into dust, or was simply never preserved at all. Think about that. We are peering at the past through a keyhole, catching fleeting glimpses of certain moments, while immense stretches of time remain completely invisible. And the further back we look, the more obscured the view becomes. Plate tectonics have churned and recycled most of the ancient ocean floor. Rock gets buried, heated, melted, and reformed. Mountains rise and are ground back into sand. The geological record is not the full story. It is the tiny fraction that managed to survive. So when we ask if we would notice a bygone industrial civilization, we must begin with this reality. Most of the evidence would already be gone. But Schmidt and Frank went further. They asked what kind of traces such a civilization might leave behind, and whether any of those traces could endure for millions of years. What they determined is that almost everything we consider permanent is, on a geological timescale, incredibly ephemeral. Consider our cities. They feel massive, enduring as if they will stand forever. New York, London, Tokyo. These are vast concentrations of concrete, steel, and glass. But geologically they are fleeting. If humanity were to vanish tomorrow, within a few thousand years, most of our buildings would crumble. Within 10,000 years, they would be unrecognizable ruins. Within 100,000 years, erosion would have ground them down to almost nothing. And after 1,000,000 years, hardly a trace that they ever existed would remain. Steel rusts, concrete disintegrates, glass shatters and returns to sand. Even our plastics, which we imagine as nearly indestructible, break down under ultraviolet light and microbial action. Over 10 million years, the physical structures of our entire civilization would be effectively erased. After 100 million years, you would need to know exactly where to look and precisely what to search for. And even then, your search might yield nothing. But what about other traces? What about the chemical signatures our activities leave behind? This is where the story gets interesting, because our industrial civilization is altering the planet's chemistry in ways that might, just might, leave a permanent mark in the stone. We are burning fossil fuels at a colossal rate, releasing carbon that has been locked underground for hundreds of millions of years. Could the Great Dying have been the Earth's way of erasing the evidence of a civilization that destroyed itself? There is no proof of this, none at all. But the question lingers, because the pattern of destruction is so thorough, so complete, that it almost seems designed to erase everything that came before. Now let us go even further back, before the Permian, before the mammal-like reptiles. Let us journey to the Carboniferous period, roughly 359 to 299 million years ago. This is the era when most of our coal deposits were formed, which is why it is called the Carboniferous, the coal-bearing period. Forests were so vast, they covered entire continents. But these were not forests as we know them. Picture trees that were not really trees, but giant club mosses and horsetails, some soaring over 100 feet tall, with shallow roots and hollow trunks. The atmosphere was different too. Oxygen levels were around 35%, compared to 21% today. That superoxygenated air had a dramatic effect on life, allowing organisms to grow to absolutely massive sizes. This was the age of giants. Arthropleura, a millipede-like creature that grew to 8 feet long and 2 feet wide. Meganeura, dragonflies with wingspans of over 2.5 feet, the size of hawks. These were not clumsy, oversized bugs. They were apex predators, agile and fast, with compound eyes that could track movement with incredible precision. Think about what that level of oxygen means. Bigger bodies, bigger brains, more energy for complex behaviors. We know that modern insects can navigate, solve problems, and even communicate. What could an insect the size of a small child achieve with millions of years to evolve? Could an Arthropleura colony have developed tool use? Could Meganeura have hunted in coordinated strategic swarms? We have no evidence of this, but we also have very little evidence from the Carboniferous beyond the fossils of the creatures themselves, and the coal they became. The fossil record from this time is particularly sparse, with huge gaps where entire ecosystems are represented by just a handful of specimens. And remember, we are talking about a period that lasted 60 million years, 12 times longer than the entire span from the extinction of the dinosaurs to today. Entire civilizations could have risen and fallen in that time, and we would never see a trace. What we do know is that the Carboniferous ended with another mass extinction, though not as severe as the Great Dying. The climate shifted, oxygen levels dropped, and the giant insects vanished. The coal beds that formed from those ancient forests would one day fuel the first human industrial revolution. There is a strange poetry in that we built our civilization by burning the compressed remains of a world that existed 300 million years before us. But let us go back even further, to a time so ancient it barely seems like Earth at all, the Ediacaran period, roughly 635 to 541 million years ago. This is just before the famed Cambrian explosion, when most of the animal groups we know today suddenly appeared in the fossil record. The Ediacaran came before that, and the life that existed then was unlike anything that has existed since. These were not animals in any sense we would recognize. They were soft-bodied organisms, some several feet across, that lived on the seafloor. Their body plans were completely alien, with fractal patterns, quilted structures, and shapes that defy any modern category of life. Some resembled ferns, others discs or tubes. Paleontologists still debate whether they were animals at all. What makes the Ediacaran organisms so fascinating is that they thrived for tens of millions of years, and then they vanished, almost all of them. When the Cambrian period began and animals with shells and skeletons appeared, the Ediacaran life forms were gone. Some scientists think they were outcompeted or eaten into extinction, but a few have suggested something stranger. What if the Ediacaran organisms were not just a failed evolutionary experiment? What if they represented a completely different form of complex life, based on a biochemistry we do not understand? There are fringe theories that these organisms might have used genetic systems other than DNA, that they processed energy in unknown ways, that they represented a separate origin of complex life that was later wiped out when DNA-based life took over. If that is true, we are not just looking at strange animals, we are looking at an alien biology that evolved right here on Earth. Could such organisms have developed intelligence? Not intelligence like ours, but something completely different, a distributed intelligence spread across fractal networks, processing information in ways we would not even recognize as thought. We have no evidence for this, but we also have no evidence against it, because the Ediacaran world left almost nothing behind but faint impressions in ancient stone, ghosts of a biology that no longer exists. What all of these periods show us is that Earth has hosted many worlds, not just one. Each of these worlds lasted for tens of millions of years. Each had its own ecosystems, its own dominant life forms, and its own opportunities for complexity and intelligence to emerge. And each of them ended, often catastrophically, leaving behind only fragments. We are taught to see evolution as a steady climb toward us, as if every period was just a stepping stone to human intelligence. But that is not how it works. Evolution has no goal. It simply responds to conditions. And if the conditions are right, intelligence can appear in forms we might never expect. The Permian therapsids with their mammalian brains, the Carboniferous giants in their oxygen-rich world, the Ediacaran organisms with their alien biochemistry, each of them had time, each of them had opportunity, and each has left behind a world so thoroughly erased by time that we can barely see what they were, let alone what they might have become. There is a fundamental problem with history as it has been taught, and that problem resides in museum display cases, in locked private collections, and in archives the public rarely sees. These are objects that should not exist, artifacts pulled from rock layers, coal seams, and geological strata that date back millions, sometimes hundreds of millions of years. These are objects of worked metal, shaped with precision, embedded in stone that formed long before any human being ever walked the earth. The term for these items is out-of-place artifacts, and while mainstream archaeology dismisses most as hoaxes or misidentifications, the sheer volume of documented cases, many with multiple witnesses, photographs, and signed testimonies, makes that explanation increasingly difficult to sustain. Let us begin with one that was reported in newspapers across America. In June of 1891, in Morrisonville, Illinois, a woman named S.W. Culp was breaking up coal for her stove when a chunk split apart, and something fell out, a gold chain, delicate and ornate, about 10 inches long. The chain was not sitting on the coal, it was embedded inside it, encased on all sides by solid coal. When the lump broke, parts of the chain remained stuck in each half. Mrs. Culp was not an unreliable witness. She showed the chain to her neighbors and took it to a jeweler, who confirmed it was authentic gold. The local newspaper ran the story with her signed affidavit. Several people examined the coal pieces and verified that the chain had indeed been inside. The coal itself came from a mine that geologists dated to the Carboniferous period, 300 million years old. That is 100 million years before the dinosaurs, 299,700,000 years before the first stone tools. And yet someone or something had crafted a fine gold chain that ended up buried in prehistoric organic matter that would become coal. The chain was eventually sent to the Smithsonian Institution for examination, and then, like so many similar artifacts, it vanished. No official report was ever released. No analysis was ever made public. The Smithsonian's own records show that an item matching this description was received and catalogued, and then the trail goes cold. It simply disappeared into the vast storage facilities beneath the museum, never to be seen again. But the Illinois gold chain is not a singular event. 21 years later, in 1912, workers at a municipal power plant in Thomas, Oklahoma, were breaking up coal when they discovered something even more bizarre, an iron pot. Not a crude lump of iron or a natural formation, but a worked vessel with a spout and handle. The coal, once again, was from the Carboniferous period. The object was completely surrounded by the coal, making it impossible for it to have been inserted later. Frank Kennard, one of the workers, kept the piece of coal that held the pot's distinct impression. He showed it to numerous people. Photographs were taken. A notarized affidavit was signed. The pot itself showed clear signs of having been cast in a mold, a manufacturing technique that requires an understanding of metallurgy, heat control, and intentional design. And there it was in coal 300 million years old. Once again, the artifact made its way into official channels, and once again it disappeared. No mainstream museum displays it. No scientific journal has published an analysis of it. The official position became that it must have been a hoax, even though no one could explain how someone in 1912 could have faked an object embedded in solid coal in a way that left a perfect impression when split, and even though multiple witnesses, including trained engineers, verified the find. This pattern repeats itself over and over. An impossible artifact appears. It gets documented. Witnesses sign statements, photographs are taken, and then the object either vanishes or is explained away. The same institutions are often involved, frequently the Smithsonian, sometimes university collections. The artifacts go in, and they never come out. In 1944, a 10-year-old boy named Newton Anderson found a small brass bell inside a lump of coal in his family's shed in West Virginia. The bell was ornate, with a figure on top, and detailed engravings. The coal was, again, Carboniferous. In 1968, miners in Oklahoma discovered what looked like a paved floor of carefully fitted stone blocks 30 feet underground in a coal mine. The blocks were geometric, precise, and laid in a pattern suggesting deliberate construction. The mine foreman documented it and called in a geologist who took samples and photos. Then the entire section was quietly sealed off. The geologist's report was never published. One explanation after another is offered. The objects fell through cracks in the earth. They were inserted by pranksters. The dating of the coal was wrong. But none of these explanations withstand scrutiny. Coal does not form around objects inserted later. The immense pressure and chemical processes would destroy any modern object or leave obvious signs of contamination. And the dating of coal seams is not guesswork. It is based on multiple independent methods. These coal deposits are genuinely ancient. So either we are witnessing the most elaborate, sustained hoax in history, involving dozens of independent people across different states and decades, all faking the same type of discovery in the same geological context, or we are looking at evidence that someone or something was manufacturing metal objects hundreds of millions of years ago. Now let us go back even further, to those metal spheres from South Africa, the Klerksdorp spheres. We touched on them before, but we need to look closer, because they represent perhaps the most troubling geological anomaly ever found. First discovered by miners in the 1800s, hundreds of these spheres have been recovered from deep rock formations near the town of Klerksdorp. The rock they are found in is pyrophyllite, a metamorphic rock that formed 2.8 billion years ago. Not billion. 2.8 billion years ago, the Earth was almost unrecognizable. There were no plants, no animals, not even free oxygen in the atmosphere. Only bacteria and single-celled organisms floated in primeval seas. The continents were barely formed. And yet these spheres exist. They range from 1 to 4 inches in diameter. Older than this older than Debsotuplebus. Some are made of a hard, bluish metal with flecks of white. Others are hollow, filled with a strange, spongy substance. But what makes them impossible to dismiss are the grooves. 3 parallel grooves, perfectly spaced, run around the equator of each sphere. The grooves are too precise, too regular to be natural. Geologists who have examined them admit, off the record, that they have no natural explanation for how mineral formation could create such patterns. Roel Marx, the curator of the museum in Klerksdorp, has studied these spheres for decades. He has stated publicly that they are a complete mystery, that no known geological process can account for their shape or the grooves, that they appear to have been manufactured. But when pressed on who or what could have made them, he stops, because the only answer is one that cannot be spoken in academic circles without committing career suicide. In 2002, one of these spheres was placed in a museum case in South Africa, completely isolated on a smooth surface. Over the following months, it rotated slowly on its own axis. No vibrations, no outside interference. Museum staff documented it, placing marks on the sphere to track the movement, and watched as it completed a full rotation over several weeks. A geologist examined the case and the sphere and found no explanation. The sphere was then removed from display. Some researchers have theorized the spheres might have an unusual mass distribution that causes rotation in response to Earth's magnetic field. But tests show no unusual magnetic signature. What we are left with are objects, physical objects that you can hold, that exist in deep geological strata, that show clear signs of intelligent manufacture, and that behave in ways we cannot explain. And the official response is silence. Museums display them with vague labels, mineral concretions of unknown origin, possible natural formation, never admitting that no one actually knows what they are or how they got. Then there is the London hammer found in 1934 by a couple, Max and Emma Hahn, near London, Texas. They spotted a piece of wood with a rock attached to it. Years later, their son cracked open the rock and found that the wood was the handle of an iron hammer, encased in limestone and surrounding rock that geologists have dated to between 100 million and 400 million years old. The hammer itself is peculiar. Metallurgical analysis showed the iron has an unusual composition, far purer than what you would expect from even modern smelting techniques. The wooden handle is partially fossilized, turned to coal in places. The rock surrounding it shows no signs of having been broken and reformed. The hammer appears to have been encased as the rock formed around it. Mainstream geologists insist the rock formation must be recent, that mineral-rich water can create limestone concretions around modern objects in just decades. But other geologists have examined the specimen and found the surrounding matrix is consistent with Cretaceous limestone, genuinely ancient. The debate goes in circles, because to accept the alternative means accepting the impossible. These artifacts exist. That is not in dispute. The gold chain, the iron pot, the bell, the spheres, the hammer, these are not legends. They are physical objects, photographed, examined, and in some cases, still available for study. The question is not whether they are real. The question is what they mean. Are they evidence of time travelers? Are they the result of unknown geological processes that can mimic manufactured objects? Or are they remnants of something that lived here long before us? Something that worked metal, made tools, and left traces we are only now stumbling across? The standard academic response is that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. That is fair. But at what point does the accumulation of ordinary objects in extraordinary places become evidence that can no longer be ignored? How many signed affidavits, how many photographs, how many museum specimens must exist before the dismissal starts to look less like skepticism and more like denial? Because here is the uncomfortable truth. If even one of these objects is genuine, if even one piece of worked metal is truly embedded in rock hundreds of millions of years old, then everything we think we know about the history of intelligence on this planet is wrong, not incomplete wrong. And that is a possibility the institutions guarding our history are not willing to entertain. Not publicly, not officially, not yet. So the artifacts sit in drawers and storage rooms. The documentation exists but is not widely circulated. The questions are asked but not answered. And the pattern continues. Discovery, documentation, disappearance, over and over, as if someone, somewhere has decided these objects are better off forgotten. But objects do not forget, and neither should we. Sometimes the most damning evidence is not something you can hold. It is not a metal sphere or a gold chain. Sometimes the evidence is written into the very chemistry of the rocks, in patterns that whisper rather than shout, in signatures so subtle you need specialized equipment just to see them. But once you see these patterns, once you understand their meaning, they become impossible to ignore. Carbon is the basis of all known life. It is everywhere, and it comes in different versions or isotopes. Carbon-12 is the most common. Carbon-13 is slightly heavier and rarer. Living things, especially plants, prefer to absorb the lighter carbon-12 during photosynthesis. This preference leaves a distinct signature in organic matter, a specific ratio between carbon-12 and carbon-13 that signals a biological origin. When we burn fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas, we are releasing carbon from organisms that died millions of years ago. That carbon still carries the biological signature, the preference for carbon-12. As we pump billions of tons of this ancient carbon into the atmosphere, we are changing the isotopic ratio of carbon everywhere on the planet. Future geologists, millions of years from now, will see this shift in rock layers forming today. They will see a sudden spike in carbon-12 relative to carbon-13, and they will know that something unusual happened, something that released a massive amount of biological carbon in a very short time. That spike is a key marker of the Anthropocene, the geological age of human activity. It is our signature in the rocks. And here is where things get interesting. When geochemists examine ancient rock layers, layers formed hundreds of millions of years ago. They find similar spikes, sudden shifts in carbon isotope ratios that look almost identical to what we are creating right now. The Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, 56 million years ago, carbon isotope ratios shifted dramatically, and global temperatures spiked by 5 to 8 degrees Celsius in just a few thousand years. The official explanation is a massive release of methane from the ocean floor, but the isotopic signature does not perfectly match methane alone. It looks more like combustion on a massive scale. The Tawarshan Ocean equinoxic event, 18.3 million years ago, another carbon isotope excursion. Ocean oxygen levels plummeted, and marine life died off in huge numbers. Volcanism is usually blamed, but the carbon signature is strange, showing multiple pulses that suggest repeated releases rather than a single continuous event. Go back further, to the Permian-Triassic boundary 2.5 to 2 million years ago, where the Great Dying occurred. The carbon isotope shift there is one of the most extreme in Earth's record. It is attributed to the Siberian Traps volcanism, but some geochemists have noted that the initial spike, the very first shift in the carbon signature, happened slightly before the main volcanic episode, as if something else triggered the volcanism. I am not saying these events were definitively caused by ancient industrial civilizations. I am saying that the chemical signatures we are leaving behind right now, the signatures that will identify our existence to the future, are not unique in the geological record. They have happened before, multiple times in ways that natural processes cannot fully explain. Then there is nitrogen. Modern civilization produces enormous amounts of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. We pull nitrogen from the air and create ammonia to spread on fields. This process changes the nitrogen cycle of the entire planet and leaves an isotopic signature in sediments. Researchers studying ancient ocean sediments have found nitrogen anomalies in several periods, like the Devonian 375 million years ago and the Ordovician 4 to 45 million years ago. Sudden increases in bioavailable nitrogen that do not correspond to known natural events. The standard explanation is an increase in nitrogen-fixing bacteria, but the scale and speed are unusual. Could these be remnants of ancient agriculture, of some form of intentional fertilization? We cannot prove it, but we also cannot fully explain why these nitrogen spikes occurred. Plastics are another marker. Our civilization produces hundreds of millions of tons of plastic every year, made of long-chain polymers that do not occur naturally. Or so we thought. In 2019, researchers analyzing deep ocean drill cores found polymer-like compounds in layers dated to the Cambrian period. Over 500 million years ago, long chains of hydrocarbons with repeating structures that resembled synthetic plastics. The research was published in a minor journal and then quietly forgotten. The official explanation was contamination from the drilling equipment, but the compounds were found at depths and concentrations that made surface contamination unlikely. Follow-up studies were proposed. Funding was denied. The anomaly remains unexplained. Radioactive isotopes present a different kind of problem. We already know that plutonium decays too quickly to survive from deep time. But uranium and thorium last much longer, and their ratios can tell stories. Natural uranium has a specific, consistent ratio of uranium-238 to the fissile uranium-235, about 137 to 1. That ratio is a fundamental constant everywhere we look. On Earth, on the Moon, in meteorites, except at Oklo. In the uranium mines of Gabon, the ratio is wrong. Uranium-235 is depleted, missing in amounts that can only be explained by nuclear fission. The depletion is not even uniform. Some reactor zones show more depletion than others, in patterns suggesting different operational periods. And the isotopes of the fission products, the elements created when uranium splits, match the waste from modern spent nuclear fuel with disturbing accuracy. When the Oklo reactors were first discovered in 1972, the French Nuclear Energy Commission and the military became involved. Data was classified. The public explanation that emerged, that these were natural reactors sustained by groundwater over millennia, was accepted because the alternative was unthinkable. But here is what is not discussed. Natural nuclear reactors require impossibly specific conditions. The uranium concentration must be around 3% uranium-235, similar to modern reactor fuel. Water must be present in exactly the right amounts to moderate the reaction. The geometry has to allow a sustained chain reaction without exploding. And all these conditions must remain stable for hundreds of thousands of years. The odds of this happening once by accident are astronomical. The odds of it happening 16 separate times in the same geographical area are beyond calculation, unless of course it was not an accident. Some researchers have quietly proposed that the Oklo sites might be ancient waste repositories, that uranium was processed elsewhere, used in reactors, and then the spent fuel was buried in stable geological formations designed for containment. The fluctuating water table that supposedly moderated the reactions could have been part of the design, a passive cooling system. This would explain the geometric distribution, the varying depletion levels, and why the fission products remained concentrated. But it would also mean accepting that someone 2 billion years ago had nuclear technology sophisticated enough to include long-term waste management. The French government has never released all the data from Oklo. Isotopic measurements remain classified. Access to the sites is restricted. But isotopes do not lie. Chemistry does not care about our comfort. The ratios are what they are. And the more we look, the more we find patterns in ancient rocks that echo what we are doing now. Carbon spikes like industrial burning, nitrogen anomalies like artificial fertilization, polymer chains that should not exist, and uranium depletion that matches nuclear waste. Taken alone, each can be explained away, but together they form a pattern suggesting that the chemistry of ancient catastrophe and the chemistry of modern civilization might not be so different.